G'day folks, have you ever wondered how the BoardGameGeek ratings and ranking system works? Why some games appear in the top 100 whilst others with a similar average user rating fall way out of the top 1000? Have you ever wondered why perhaps your favourite game with a great average user rating appears so low in these rankings whilst other games with lower average user ratings appears quite high, perhaps in the top 100 of BoardGameGeek's rankings? Well, this video is designed to explain how this system works, and the short, oversimplified answer to this is that games need more ratings to approach their average user rating. For the more complex answer, keep watching. If we go to the top BoardGameGeek ranked games today, we can see two distinguishing features of those top ranked games. Firstly, they have very high average ratings, and most of the games in the top 100 have ratings from the users above 8.0. The top games have ratings above 8.2, 8.3. Gloomhaven is currently sitting on 8.8. The second key feature here is the number of voters. These games typically have tens of thousands of voters contributing data to the site. And it's those number of voters that is most critical for reasons which I'll go into. Now, if you browse around BoardGameGeek, you'll encounter many other games with similar, if not higher, average ratings. Just looking at the top 10 games on BoardGameGeek, you'll notice that Twilight Struggle has a rating of 8.3. If you scroll down to game number 12, you'll see that War of the Rings 2nd Edition has a higher average rating, 8.47. So why is Twilight Struggle ranked higher? Why does it have a higher geek rating than War of the Ring when War of the Ring has a higher average rating? You can look at the top 3 games in the second and third ranked game in particular. Pandemic Season 1 has an average rating of 8.62, and yet it has a higher geek rating than Brass Birmingham with the rating of 8.64. So why is Brass Birmingham with a higher average rating ranked below Pandemic Legacy? The critical thing here is the number of voters. And to explain this before I go into the maths, there are a number of dummy votes seeded into the geek rating. In other words, there are about 1,400, and I'll go through the maths in a moment for those interested, 1,400 dummy votes of around 5.5. Now, to overcome that average of 5.5, games need thousands of user votes to push them away from that 5.5. In other words, this Bayesian average and the number of these dummy votes wants to pull all these games back towards 5.5. And in effect, the user votes, the average rating of these games, is needed to push these games and their geek rating away from that 5.5. If we think of 5.5 as almost like a black hole of ratings that pulls all games towards them, you need thousands of user ratings for a game, tens of thousands really, to push it away from 5.5, to get it to a point where those average ratings from users are sufficient in number such that the number of dummy ratings becomes less important. This is most noticeable when we look at the games with 30 ratings. Now, back in 2004, 2005, the developers decided that a game would not receive a geek rating or a ranking unless it had 30 votes. So we can go and look at these games with 29 votes with no geek rating, and then we hit these games with 30 ratings which start to present a geek rating, and in some cases maybe a rank. If you look at those geek ratings, you'll notice they are all very close to 5.5. This is because these games are so heavily seeded with a vast number of dummy ratings that their actual user ratings and the average user rating from across their 30 users is largely inconsequential. In fact, you'll notice just by looking at this list that no game has has a geek rating lower than 5.4, and none of them go above 5.6. Even those games lowly rated like Worlds of Heroes and Tyrants with an average user rating of 2.8 still has a geek rating of 5.4, whilst relatively highly ranked or rated games such as Panzer Miniatures Rules, with an average user rating of 8, can only push as high as 5.538. Again, because of those dummy ratings wanting to pull it back to 5.5. It's still the case again as games approach 250 user ratings. A game like Reluctant Enemies Operation Exporter, with an average user rating of 7.96, relatively high, only has 250 user votes. And as such, these dummy ratings are pulling it back to the 5.5, and it has a Geek rating of 5.827. Even at 500 user ratings, a game like Conflict of Heroes: The Eastern Front solo expansion has an average user rating of 8.48, comparable with many of those games in the top 10. However, because there are only 500 user ratings, its Geek rating remains at 6.214, 2.2 points below its average user rating. Again, still heavily weighted by all those dummy ratings. Even as we push towards 1,000 user votes, a game like Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit 3, with 978 user votes, with an average user rating of 8.01, is still being drawn down by all those dummy votes, such that its user rating is 6.437. Even as we approach 5,000 votes, a game like Viticulture Tuscany Essential Edition, with 4,767 users voting it for an average user rating of 8.65. Again, very comparable with games in the top 5 of BoardGameGeek's ratings and rankings, only has a Geek rating of 7.882, still about 0.8 off its average user rating. Now, something else to point out very quickly is that board game expansions do not receive a rank. So they receive a user rating, we can see the number of voters, we can see the Geek rating, which is this formula, but those expansions won't receive a rank. And they won't appear in lists of ranked board games. It's only really when we get to the games with 10,000 votes that these Geek ratings begin to approach the average user rating. A game like Twilight Imperium 4th edition with 11,700 votes has an average user rating of 8.69 and has a Geek rating of 8.219. Now the critical thing here is that at this stage, with 11,000 votes, the number of dummy votes is beginning to look inconsequential. That number of dummy votes that still brings the average down is overpowered in effect by the number of user votes. Now the key message here, which I'll return to in a moment, is that the Geek rating, to overpower all these votes in the dummy system, games require tens of thousands of votes. This is perhaps the most evident if we rank games by the number of voters. Now on BoardGameGeek, Pandemic has the most number of votes with 96,738. And if we compare their average rating, 7.61, to their Geek rating, 7.517, we'll notice they are very close. Carcassonne comes next, 96,707. Its average rating is 7.42, its Geek rating is 7.310. At this point, the vast number of user votes, 96,000, far overpowers and exceeds the dummy votes that are seeded in to create that Geek rating, such that while the dummy votes are still factored in, they are largely insignificant. Now, bear with me while I explain some more of the background and the maths involved in this. Basically, back in 2004-2005, the developers of BoardGameGeek decided that in addition to showing the average user rating, the total number of ratings for a game divided by the number of users, they would also create this Geek rating. Now this was that average rating plus a number of dummy ratings. And in 2004 or 2005, they decided that they would include 30 dummy ratings of 5.5. So the Geek rating was these two ratings combined and then divided by the total number of users plus the number of these dummy ratings. So in 2005, the relatively small number of dummy ratings, 30, skewed these results somewhat, but not a great deal. In 2005, the ranking simply ordered the Geek ratings from the highest to the lowest, with the highest Geek rated games is from the Geek rating with those dummy ratings, getting ranked number 1, and then following down from there. So at the time, Puerto Rico was the top ranked game based on those Geek ratings. In 2006, Aldie announced that as BoardGameGeek users increased, the number of dummy ratings would also increase to 100, and this further skewed these results and the Geek ratings. Thus, for the exact same game, with the exact same number of users and the exact same ratings, the same game, hypothetical game, we now take those average user ratings of 7.5, but we're adding a lot more dummy ratings, and thus the Geek rating is reduced to 5.9. Over time, Aldie said, the number of dummy ratings would increase as the number of BoardGameGeek users increase, and that's been evident over the past 10 years in particular. Now recently, BoardGameGeek surpassed 2 million users, and I've done a few different calculations on these different ratings, and I estimate that the number of dummy ratings is around 1,450. Thus again, for the exact same game, with the same number of still 30 users rating this game a total of 225, averaging 7.5. We take this game, but now there are 1,450 dummy ratings. And the revised Geek rating for this exact same game is now 5.54. And again, this demonstrates how these dummy ratings pull all these games back towards this sort of black hole of 5.5 in the middle. This is the Bayesian average taking effect. Keeping in mind, throughout all these calculations, there are all these little other secret modifiers, which I'll talk about in a moment. So what effect does this have on board games, their average rating, their user ratings, and their rankings? Basically, it means that games with more user ratings are more likely to get a closer Geek rating to their average rating. So a game like poker, for example, which many people have played, has about 8,900 user ratings, and the average user rating for this is around 6.7. It's relatively low, but because there are so many ratings, they make those dummy ratings relatively, or less significant, I'll say. Thus, the user rating is 6.496, relatively close to their average user rating. However, a game like Unconditional Surrender, which has 770 user ratings with an average rating of 8.33, only rates 6.383, below poker, simply because the number of those dummy ratings overpowers the number of user ratings. And thus, poker is rated and ranked higher than Unconditional Surrender, and many other games with a similar number of votes with a similarly high average user rating. The bottom line here is that these dummy votes make most voting for these games insignificant until a game has somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 votes. It's somewhere in there that the number of average user ratings begins gradually to make those dummy votes insignificant. Thus, if you've heard someone say, oh, rate my game really highly, rate my game a 10 on BoardGameGeek, that's great. You can go ahead and rate the game whatever you want. But unless you can get 5,000 to 10,000 of your friends to do the same thing, it means that the Geek rating will inevitably be drawn very heavily towards 5.5, and there'll be a Geek ranking to match. Now, we're very fortunate to have Tom Letermite, a user on BoardGameGeek, who's produced some great graphs illustrating the limitations of this Bayesian average system that applies to Geek ratings and rankings. And he showed that, well, pretty much between BoardGameGeek ranking 1,000 and BoardGameGeek 11,000, there isn't much difference in the BoardGameGeek rating that applies to the ranking of these games. Most games in this range are drawn so heavily to 5.5 that there is very little to distinguish them. And as such, it means that sort of once you begin to, well, head outside the top 800, these BoardGameGeek ratings and rankings really don't mean much, because they all come down to the number of users that have rated these games. An outstanding game that had a limited production, perhaps of just 500 games, doesn't stand a chance of getting anywhere close to the top 500 games. Whereas a terribly poor game that has been mass produced and a lot of people have rated it has a better chance, in fact, of getting into the top 1,000. And thus, this brings me back to the point that I raised in my last video on war games, and that is that the BoardGameGeek rating and ranking system is really oriented towards the mass appeal of games. It's really not about the quality of game or how good a game is. It is largely around accessibility and how much these games might appeal to a broad public audience. People will have different opinions on that. Some will say, well, yeah, this is a good way for BoardGameGeek to orient themselves to this broad user base. More than 2 million users. They're obviously doing something very good. At the same time, it's disappointing because it means that so many outstanding games simply don't stand a chance of really reaching the top 500, 1,000, 2,000 because of their limited production runs. Many boutique games, of course, are so lavishly produced and highly researched, but are printed in such short print runs that they never stand a chance, and I think that's very disappointing. At the same time, it reinforces the need for us to be aware of this and critical of the rankings that we see on BoardGameGeek. If you're like me, you'll often use these rankings just to browse games, see what new games have appeared, see what's being rated and ranked highly. And I typically can almost stop my searches when I get to the top 1,000. I'll often skim through the top 1,000 games just to see what new editions they are. Beyond that though, it's really just a mess of games, largely ordered by number of ratings rather than the quality of those games themselves. And I think that's something that perhaps the BoardGameGeek developers could pay more attention to create some separate type of system that gives greater recognition to all those, there's many amazing games between, let's say, rank 500 and rank 12,000. The bottom line again, as I said, is not to rely on those BoardGameGeek ratings or rankings really once you head outside the top 500. Now I mentioned those other secret modifiers. What are they? Well, we don't know for sure because they're secret, but over the years the developers have kind of indicated that they are trying to eliminate shill votes. And look, I suspect, now this is purely based on sort of what I've heard and seen and read over the years, I suspect this eliminates votes from users that either have new accounts or who don't have enough votes attached to their account. I suspect this is designed to eliminate the idea that a publisher can come along, create 100 different accounts and just vote their games 10 out of 10, or to vote their competitors' games 1 out. I suspect that somewhere in this algorithm, BoardGameGeek eliminates all of those votes. And there's various things pointing towards this, looking through the data on various games and the users who rate these games 1 and so forth. But again, there's no kind of concrete evidence to back that up. This is just my suspicion and theory based on what I've read. So there you go. That's kind of an overview with some gaps around those secret modifiers on how the BoardGameGeek ranking system works. Having said all of this, as I said, I use this ranking system a lot to browse through games, to look at new releases, to see what's popular. Perhaps this is, you know, the best system given the 2 million users and many voters that come onto BoardGameGeek. And it's probably a bit rude of me to criticize this system without suggesting another alternative. I don't know what the best way to resolve this system is. It's good, however, as I said, to understand how this works, so that we can be more mindful of what we're looking at when we're browsing through these rankings and ratings. Thanks for watching, and I hope that's helped.